I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. So begins one of the most famous of the Christmas carols of all time. This Christmas carol was never intended to be a Christmas carol. It was never intended to be a public poem. It was, in fact, a private poem. It was written by a famous poet who was attempting to document how to cope when circumstances were outrageous at the one time of year when no bad thing should happen to anybody. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is this explorer of the dark recesses of the human soul. And as he moves through this, you will not only notice that his life was composed of great joys, but great tragedy. And it is these great tragedies that gives him an authority to speak about how to get through tough times when it is the time of year when absolutely nobody should be having a tough time. And this is a strange time of year. Surreal elves taking the place of angels, reanimated snow persons taking the place of saviors, and gravitationally impaired overachievers attempting to endow each child on the planet with gifts instead of the original Christmas gift that gave all subsequent Christmas gifts their genesis and meaning. Surreal indeed. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, as I said, was a man of great extremes, both good and unusually bad. Let's focus for a minute on the good. He was a child genius, a prodigy in the classic sense of the word. He was graduating college at the same moment when all the friends of his same age were struggling to finish high school. Harvard approached him upon his graduation from college, begging him to come aboard and teach there. He turned them down, and not only turned them down, but said he was going to get married and have a 1 or 2 year honeymoon touring Europe, and that perhaps when he was back, if they could wait and they were still interested, he'd be willing to talk. Harvard waited. He was able to find his soulmate, not the way we use the term today to just mean somebody you really, really like, but soulmate in that classic sense that he'd found someone who could utterly meet all of his needs and that he could utterly meet all of hers. And he was extremely excited about that meeting. He also was, not only in his own day, but as well in ours, one of the world's most famous of the American English poets and authors. Perhaps the most amazing historical note is that unlike the great, great writers and poets before him, 2,500 years ago, Aristotle and Plato, 1,000 years ago, Geoffrey de Chaucer, 500 years ago, William Shakespeare, not one of these individuals could actually live off of their writing. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was the first human being in the history of the world to be able to live off of his writing. And perhaps the lasting tribute that remains to this day, as you casually read through his poetry, you will discover that he coined many of the phrases and many of the expressions that we are still using to this day. We often don't know that we are quoting Longfellow, but we are. Among the very bad, his first wife, who, by the way, was actually quite wonderful, they did meet under the most unusual circumstances. He fell in love with her, but found that even though he was a wordsmith of the English language, was incapable of speaking in her presence. He was so shy. Today we would call it stalking. He would follow her home from church, careful to stay 40 paces behind her. And finally one day, Mary Storer Potter turned and said, "Mr. Longfellow, come have some lemonade and let's finally talk to each other." And that was the beginning of an amazing courtship and an amazing relationship. He had found his soulmate, and in something that reminds us of celebrity in our own time, They were young, they were beautiful, they were rich, they were famous, and they were traveling for a year or two as a honeymoon. About a month into the honeymoon, Mary goes to Henry and says, in about another 8 months, the circle of our love will expand. You are going to be a father. Henry is overjoyed, and it is a great time. But in the ensuing 8 months, every month, Mary's health gets worse and worse and worse and worse until finally, just a few days before the birth, the doctor concludes that either the mother or the child will be lost in the birth process. But 3 days before she goes into labor, suddenly Mary rallies. She's feeling great. She's getting back out of bed. She's laughing. She's joking. She's working around the house. And it looks as if their darkest fears will not be realized. When she does go into labor 72 hours later, both she and the child die. Henry is inconsolable, but is so persuaded that he got to marry his soulmate, he vows to never marry again, because he realizes that to marry a second time is to, in fact, keep the second wife forever second in his heart, and he will not do that to a lady. However, 7 years later, he is invited to a reading of Shakespeare where he meets Frances Fanny Appleton. Frances Fanny Appleton is young, beautiful, well-traveled, intellectual, well-educated, and because they're both type A personalities, they have a much stormier courtship. But they do get married. They do have 7 children together, and almost 2 decades of fame and wealth and world travel and just an amazing life. On July 8, 1863, Mary writes in her diary, "It is so humidly hot. I pray for a breeze just to cool us off from this monotonous humidity." And a day later, she is in the very act of sealing children's locks of hair. That seems somehow like another age, and it is. But in this other age, it was not common that every child survive birth as it is today. Not common that every child live past their 6th birthday, or common that every child live past their 12th birthday, or survive their teens, or actually get into adulthood. There was much uncertainty and much premature death in that era. And because of that, keepsakes such as locks of hair kept in sealing wax were hugely important to Victorian Americans. And so on that day, July 9th, 1863, Mary has a lit candle, not the typical candle for light, but sealing wax that would then drip down on the locks of hair on a piece of wax paper. And that breeze that Mary prayed for the day before came blowing through the window and blew the flame of the candle back onto the ruffly sleeve of her blouse. It's very hard to imagine in our own time because for decades our clothing has been flame retardant. But in 1863 that was not the case, and almost instantly her blouse got on fire. It is said by those who saw her that it's very likely she was attempting to run away from the flames, not fully understanding that the flames were already on her. She ran into Henry's study. Henry understood what to do immediately and tackled her, attempting to put out the flames. In an act that seems superhuman but can be accounted for by an adrenaline rush, the tiny Fanny Longfellow grabbed her large husband and hurled him across the room and continued to run around the study with the flames on her. He tackles her again, and in spite of his best efforts, his wife would die of her burns 3 hours later. And 3 days later, when it was time for him to attend her funeral, he was not even able to get out of bed because of the burns over his face, chest, and arms. Many who recognize the picture of Longfellow will recall a flowing mane of gray hair, very Einstein-like, and a huge bushy white beard. And what few understand is that that hair was grown out specifically to cover the burn marks all over his face and neck and shoulders.